Hello and welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Short. My background is in population genomics and studying the genetic causes of rare disease. I did my PhD at the Sanger Institute in the University of Cambridge and have been in biotech since 2018 when I started Sonogenetics. Sonogenetics helps academic and industry researchers to run large-scale genetic testing programs that speed up their clinical trials, generate data sets for the next big breakthrough, and give participants the best possible experience taking part in research. Each episode of the Genetics Podcast, we bring you insights from the leading minds in genetics and precision medicine, including household names and Nobel Prize winners, as well as early career scientists and biotechs working on the next big breakthrough. Whether you are a scientist, entrepreneur, executive, patient advocate, or simply someone curious about how genetics shapes our world, you're in the right place. Thank you for listening, and let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm very excited to be here today with Sharon Terry, who's the CEO of Genetic Alliance, and someone that I've been wanting to interview for a really long time because she has just been a force in the rare disease community, advocating on behalf of patients and families and driving just some incredible research and projects over the years. I'm not going to do justice to your background, Sharon, so I'd love if you could just give people a little bit of a backstory of how you got into this in the first place and maybe some of the big projects that you've been proud of yourself and the team working on over the years.
Okay, super. Thanks, Patrick. It's great to be here. I come to this not in a typical fashion, although probably typical for a lot of parents. My kids were diagnosed in 1994 with a rare genetic disorder called pseudoxanthoma elasticum, and PXE means never having to say pseudoxanthoma elasticum. So PXE was thrust into our lives like all of us with some surprise. And what we quickly learned was that you just don't go to the drugstore and buy the treatment for a rare disease, 7,000 of them, as I'm sure your listeners know. And so I took the bull by the horns, and with my husband, we began to realize that there wasn't much done, wasn't much known, did a bunch of things, put together a research consortium by reading papers of people who had been interested in PXE, collected blood and tissue on about 100, 200, 300 people, borrowed lab space at night at Harvard and found the gene ourselves and patented the gene in those days, mostly to keep the university's hands off of the gene. And so I could license it for $1 to my first licensee, which was GeneDx back in 1999, and then went on to lead clinical trials in all of that. During those years, I had a lot of parents come to me and say, oh, I want a registry, I want a biobank, I want an IRB, how do I get one? And Genetic Alliance was already in existence 10 years when PXE International, the foundation I created, was born. And so I joined Genetic Alliance, became president of the board, and in 2004 took over the CEO-ship of Genetic Alliance, so about 21 years ago. We brought everything we had done for PXE to Genetic Alliance, and Genetic Alliance therefore ran the first lay-led registry system in the world, and we still run a very robust system where people control their own data. We have the only lay-led biobank in the world, and so we do that for cross disease, any disease that wants to use the infrastructure. And then we have our own IRB. We've done a lot of policy work. We led the coalition that got the Genetic Information Non-discrimination Act passed in 2008. That took us 12 and a half years prior to that passage. And now our biggest project is iHope Genetic Health, which is sequencing the world's undiagnosed kids in low to middle income countries who are sick.
I have so many follow-up questions to unpack there. I want to actually start with the first layperson-led biobank. What do layperson-led biobanks do well and differently that most other biobanks miss?
Yeah, so the reason we established it is when we looked into the commercial or academic-led biobanks, we saw two problems. One is we immediately had a problem with even storing our DNA at Harvard. And it was because the institution and the researchers wanted to keep the samples there. So when we said, let's collaborate with the University of Hawaii or Vanderbilt or whatever, they freaked out and locked our freezers. Very major and difficult happening for us. We quickly learned that they were not going to be partners in the way that we needed them. In other words, let the data be open, let this be considered essentially a pre-competitive asset, not a post-competitive product. We definitely get commercializing that. The other part for me was the commercial banks were wide open, which is great. Anybody and their brother could come and sister could come and do all kinds of work on these samples. But, we had that point maybe found 500 people with PXE in the world. And to think the samples would go out to a postdoc learning to sequence, because in those days, that's what everyone was doing, was just a travesty for the preciousness of these samples. So we created an infrastructure by contracting with a partner, sometimes an academic group, sometimes a commercial bank, and commercial standards apply. Our IRB oversees it, but the advocacy group itself has the right to decide where will these samples be used, how will they be used. The people get to choose, does my sample get to be used or not? Can I pull it out? And so on. So unlike the institution, which is really stewarding its interests, we're stewarding the interests of the individuals who live with the disease.
Yeah, I really like that. How have you found like setting up that from an infrastructure perspective? Were you able to work with commercial providers, but to get them to play by your rules, or how did you do that?
Oh my gosh. We are on our fourth vendor over the 30 years. It's painful because what happens is as soon as we get a bolus of important samples in there, and again, who defines what's important? PXE's never been important. Nobody's ever, tried to go after them except for the lockdown we experienced. But we get, for example, African Americans who have COVID samples, or we get chronic fatigue syndrome or psoriasis or something else. Then the vendor who is holding the samples starts to believe they're very valuable. And either they want to parlay their value to pharma companies or they want to charge us more. And the other problem for us is over 30 years, lots of turnover in lots of staff, of course. And people don't remember that originally this institution, whatever the vendor is, agreed to do this as a philanthropic venture, not as a way to make money. So that's been extremely stressful to figure out how do we keep reminding the owners and the stockholders of these companies, this was because you wanted to do good, not because you wanted to make money. And how do we keep them to understanding that it's the advocacy group that owns these samples, not you, and know they cannot be parlayed in ways that you think might be useful.
Yeah, what have you learned about the role that money plays in this kind of system? In the UK, I'm from the US originally, but I live in the UK. There's a debate going on, like an actually structured debate that feeds into some decisions that will be made at some point around whether the NHS data is monetized in the UK. And there's a healthy public dialogue, but you have a version of this in rare disease world and in health research more broadly, which is samples sometimes have very little value, but sometimes they have enormous value, and it depends on the context, and it's hard to know ahead of time, and it can be, it can cause all sorts of problems if it's not thought about correct. I'm wondering what you've learned about how to manage that nonprofit and for-profit alliance to do the most good so that you get the sustainability in Genetic Alliance or your partner organizations, but also don't go too far in the other direction.
Yeah, so that's a great question. We were one of the first umbrella advocacy groups to actually put industry folks on our board. Elliot Hillback from Genzyme Days came and served on the board of Genetic Alliance. So I didn't shy away from the fact that money's involved. We live in a capitalist economy. It's going to have to be involved. What I've really pushed hard for is for us as a culture, as an economy, to see that these are really assets that are coming into the pipeline like air. It's not like gold. So we shouldn't be treating the data or the samples as something that should be monetized. We could be treating what comes out of the pipeline as products that could be monetized. And I also get that on the way in, it has to be paid for. So if now I've collected 5,000 people with PXE's blood tissue data, that costs me a lot of money. If a pharma company is going to partner with me to use that, access fees can apply in a partnership rather than just straight out, let me just sell you this because it's an asset like oil or gold and you do whatever you want with it. So I see it more as a continuum where I'm involved, first of all, in each step so that ethical decisions are made. And I do this in a nonprofit. I'm the president of Esperar in Europe, in Geneva, that repurposes drugs. So when we make deals with the companies that are going to put the drugs forward, again, benefit has to come back to us as a nonprofit, Esperar, but also to the people who are living with the disease. So I think money's going to have to stay in the game, but I think we're kind of trying to grasp at straws and make profit in places that we shouldn't be.
Yeah. How have you seen rare disease drug development change over the time you've been running this? There've been a lot of different forces, both legislative, technological, and I'm just curious to hear what your perspective is today compared to 10 years ago and maybe 20 years ago.
Yeah, and boy, does it change constantly. As you can imagine, 30 years, I've seen a lot of presidential administrations come in and out of the U.S. and a lot of change in various regulations at the FDA and other places and EMA. I've seen gratitude that we have an Orphan Drug Act that got rare disease research incentivized. And then I saw a big swing of the pharma companies when they realized there was no blockbuster model anymore because of precision medicine, which essentially made all common conditions rare in kind of crass terms. I saw those companies run toward rare diseases. As soon as they realized that it's very hard to do proper clinical trials in rare diseases, for lots of reasons, and some of them overcomable. For example, they continued to use massive CROs to try to recruit for these trials when in fact the advocacy groups, I mean, I just recruited for a trial that's public for Daiichi Sankyo for a phase 2 in PXE, and it took us about 6 weeks to recruit the 65 people needed for the trial. It would have taken a CRO probably
Like
two,
it's
3
$10 million.
years.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And they didn't pay us $10 million,
Right.
right? So I've seen sort of this shift toward rare diseases. And then lately, a shift away from rare diseases because they cost too much and they're not making the profits that the companies had hoped. With regard to the law, I think there's also been some confusion because now the Orphan Drug Act is, I think, 40 years old. It's a lot of years old. The FDA named me a 30 anniversary hero, I think, almost 10 years ago. It worked when we saw rare diseases in a certain way, 1 in 200,000 people in the US, for example. With the advent of personalized medicine, precision medicine, we now have breast cancers, and they're all rare, and liver cancers, and they're all rare. And so I think we need to redefine this because I don't think we should be leaving out the rare breast cancer. Some
Yeah.
advocates do believe we should, and it should just be Mendelian disorders. But I think, on the other hand, we can't have the same incentives work for all of this because the incentives are not working is the problem. And while the FDA has tried to be pretty flexible and get more drugs approved in the rare disease realm, we still only have, I don't know what, 300 and something drugs approved for 7,000 diseases. And some of those are repeats for diseases that already had therapies.
Right. Yeah, do you have any thoughts on how that might be updated from a policy perspective?
So more and more, and this is extremely Pollyannish in this climate and probably this world even, I think that rare diseases have to be treated like public health emergencies are. So we banded together super well with COVID. We, as countries around the globe, shared data. We got to what we needed quickly, relatively quickly. I don't think there's going to be a business model for rare diseases, and I'm probably going to get like all kinds of bows and arrows shot at me for saying that. But I think really we need subsidies from governments to say this is a public health problem on a massive scale because there are X number of millions of people with rare diseases. I mean, we estimate for our iHope program, there's probably 250 million undiagnosed kids in low-income countries in the world. Those kids deserve the same technology access that all the other kids do. And then they're diagnosed and they can't get access to the therapy if there is one. Other problem. But the problem with rare diseases writ large, I think, is there won't be a business model that's going to give back enough because of fat in the system of trying to develop a clinical trial, but also just because of the natural challenges of low numbers and variable phenotype and so on. So what I look for is an age, and I'll be dead when this happens because I'll have died, I hope, of old age. I'm looking for a day when the world's governments decide this needs to be taken care of the way we take care of public health. And so it will be subsidized by governments, and data sharing will be mandated so that we can do it much more quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting, and because it does require a totally different paradigm, right? You need international collaboration for everything from beginning to end. So it's an interesting idea. I'm from a technology perspective, I'm interested in there's 2 companies that I've learned about recently and a nonprofit. So Lorem is a nonprofit. I think has a very cool model. There's a profit company, Everyone Medicines, that's taking a similar approach to try to treat the very long tail ultra rare in a scalable way. I think there's a potential path there. The other approach that's interesting to me is basket trials. And I interviewed the CEO of Alterna, which is biotech that's treating based on the genetic triplet change across a wide range of diseases. And so I think there may be some technological impacts we can have, but we have to solve that business model challenge. Right? If it's $3 billion to develop a new drug, then it just cuts 99% of the rare diseases out of the market, right?
Yes.
Until that changes, then it's hard to imagine seeing much difference.
Yeah. And I think pharma probably would say, and we're having the same problem with common conditions because if we have to spend this much money and then the audience for our drug is much lower than it used to be. It isn't everybody with XYZ arthritis or Alzheimer's or whatever it is. Then they are facing the same thing on that scale too. And so I think we haven't sat down as people to figure this out. And I really wish that, think tanks like the World Economic Forum or WHO would take on these massive problems that instead I think they're seemingly sneaking up on us. I don't think they are. I think they're loud and a big monster behind us. But we need to turn around and say, hey, you're right there. It's not working. What are we going to do?
Yeah, why do you think, what is it about the combination of rare disease? Because as an aggregate, the impact on public health is enormous. What is it about that you think makes it hard for international collaboration to wrap its arms around?
Yeah, I am one of the co-founders of the International Rare Disease Research Consortium, which I think is now 12 years ago. We sat in Iceland and founded it, and luminaries like Francis Collins were involved, and Alexandra Bragi was also involved. And in the early days, I think we had enough passion and vision to say, we do have to treat this differently. We have to figure out how the major funders in the world, first of all, need to come together. And a lot of those are governmental funders like the NIH and have common conditions around how funding is made and so forth. I haven't seen it realize what I hoped it would realize. It's made some changes and they're important ones and so forth. But I think the problems are probably twofold. One, in aggregate, the rare diseases are considerable. However, the rare diseases themselves fragment pretty fast in the sense that even the advocacy leadership or the researchers love to kind of retreat into their own silos and not so much work together. I mean, it's the work of Genetic Alliances to get all these organizations. We have 10,000 communities and full-blown nonprofits working together. And it's so hard because everyone says, but my disease, but my disease. Very, very long time ago, I wrote, maybe 15 years, an end to earmarking in the U.S. Congress for any disease. Boy, was I super unpopular because there are some major earmarks and they still sit there today. I think if we could figure out how we could get on a page where we were sharing a lot more and working together a lot more, it would make a lot of difference. But again, people really like their own issue. So we take, for example, something like my iHope program, which diagnoses undiagnosed kids. There's no way I can tell you that there'll be X number of lysosomal storage disorders or X number of neurologic conditions, but pharma and parents and nonprofit funders want you to focus on their diseases, probably because they had some either personal success with it or personal issue with it. And so they really don't want to broaden this the way that we would need to broaden it in order for us to look at it. And so I think until we get a sensibility, and I don't know if we ever will, of the we rather than the me, I don't think we're going to be able to see the change that we would really hope for there.
Yeah, let's talk about iHope Genetic Health. I'd love to hear the story, the motivation behind starting it, and a little bit about the program.
Yeah. So it's very exciting. It brings together everything Genetic Alliance has ever done, which is exciting to me because we need the support, we need the biobank, we need the registry system that allows people to control their own data and so forth. So probably now 11 years ago, Illumina, the sequencing company, decided that there were people who needed whole genome sequencing and that they would like to do that in a philanthropic basis. And so they built a program called iHope internally. A guy named Ryan Taft ran it. He had a number of important individuals who really joined in, Julio Ortega and Aaron Thorpe and so forth, all became part of this cadre of folks at Illumina who essentially went out to the world's low to middle income countries and US at the time and said, who needs sequencing? These are, 11 years ago, still pretty early for a sick kid to get a whole genome sequence. And they sequenced over the last 10 years, 9 years that they were in operation, about 2,000 kids. And they've published a paper on 1,000 of them. And it's quite remarkable. The findings were that when you compare high-income countries to low to middle-income countries, you actually get more diagnoses in the low to middle income. Probably not surprising. Those kids have not gone through panels and extensive testing. But you also get the pushback that they receive right away was don't diagnose those kids. They're not going to get any treatment. They're not, they're going to be left out in the cold. On the one hand, and that's a whole other issue, as a parent, I think we need information and that is therapeutic. So I'm all for knowing when someone's born, they have PXE, which is actually a late onset disease, supposedly. That aside, got to being able to see also through the data they collected that more than 70% of these kids had change in management. So there
Wow.
was differences in diagnostic thinking. There was differences in how their case was handled by the clinician. And the other thing they kind of blew the lid off was you didn't need a geneticist who had extensively phenotyped a kid to be the one to order this test. They had pediatricians. They had advocates in some, in some countries. They had psychologists and so on. So what they did is built up this network of labs around the world. They did all the sequencing at Illumina, and they gave clinical results back to the clinicians. And that was the end of the story, pretty much. They wanted to expand that, and they knew that there were a lot of pieces of that they couldn't do in-house. And so they gave us, Genetic Alliance, the iHope program, which we call iHope Genetic Health, in the hope that someday we'll have iHope anything else, any cancer or
Yes.
infectious disease. So a philanthropic whole genome, whole exome sequencing. And what we did is Ryan left Illumina, and he's now the chief scientific officer of Genetic Alliance, albeit for free because we're poorly funded as always. And Aaron left Illumina and runs the iHope program at Genetic Alliance. And we couldn't use the Illumina lab anymore. So put out an RFP now 2 years ago, got about 30 labs applying around the world to do clinical whole genome sequencing pro bono. 3 of them met our criteria. We now have 4 because we just added a recent one. But essentially, we were able to contract and work with Sick Kids and Children's Hospital of Ontario together, Eastern Ontario together, New York Genome Center, Mendellix, a company in Brazil, and more recently, Galatea, a company in Miami, Florida. And so they receive the samples from these 15 sites and sequence them and send the results back to the clinicians who give them to the families. The clinician and the family members are registered in a system that's been built by a company called Arithmetic, and that system allows the individuals to be managed, but also to manage their own data, to answer surveys, to bring in other information, and to keep their genome there in case they want to use it for something else. We are very excited that we did 500 kids in 2024. We just tallied up our numbers, and we are hoping to do double that in 2025. Illumina gives us the reagents to do this for free, pro bono. The labs give us their manpower, woman power for free. And the clinicians are all doing this for free as well. So our work really is to coordinate all of that, and then also to raise the funds for shipping and customs and licenses and, all the things that tariffs and everything else disrupt in terms of our getting those samples to those labs. Our dream is that we would do this in country in all the places that need it. So right now, we are working in Africa and South America and Central America and Southeast Asia. We'd like to empower the labs there by bringing in funding for them to build the infrastructure to do that in their country.
That's amazing. Which countries are you operating in right now? Sorry if I missed it.
I didn't say them, and I can give you a list, but yeah, Mexico, Ghana, Zimbabwe, many countries, and Erin would be able to name them like that. It's why she's in charge of the network, and I'm in charge of the fundraising and trying to get the program to grow.
That's amazing. What's been the most surprising thing to you that you've learned from the program?
I think so far, certainly the science is fascinating, and Ryan and Aaron's paper is really interesting. In fact, American Society of Human Genetics called it one of their top 10 papers this past year. But I think for me, it's been the people part. So when we get the network on a Zoom together, and again, they're from all over the world, they speak all kinds of languages and have all sorts of cultures, just the warmth and generosity of the labs and the clinics and their passion for getting this done. It isn't surprising in a way to me because I've been in this world so long, but the passion and energy of these executives and laboratorians and clinicians to overcome the obstacles in their institutions to do this. Because you can imagine in a time when economies are disrupted and there's scarcity all around, it's not so easy to do this kind of philanthropy. So really praising them for overcoming the obstacles in their own institutions and even kind of capitalizing on the goodwill when it was there, because these are also institutions that have goodwill. Figuring out how to connect those dots has been really a wonder to behold. And I'm so grateful for their passion and their commitment and their energy.
Yeah, that's amazing. You mentioned earlier being involved in the original advocacy that led to the Genetic Information Non-discrimination Act. I'm curious to get your perspective on how whether that needs to change or be updated in the future. There's a constant discussion about whether it goes far enough and the implications as we start to see genetics in almost every aspect of healthcare in the next decade. People have this concern in the US and in a way that they don't have in some other countries that have different protections. I'm just curious to get your perspective on that, since it's been a little while since it's been put in place and it's changed.
Yeah, it's been quite a while. And in fact, it had a provision whereby it would be revisited. I think it was at the 6-year mark. And when that came up, we decided not to revisit it because we were very worried about the climate that it was in. One of the problems with revising a law like that, an act, is that it could be then annihilated or gutted further if it gets opened. So what we're left with is, yes, you are protected in employment and health insurance, and the EEOC is the arbiter of that, the place you go if you have a complaint. They at least continue to say there's not a large number of complaints. Very few have been brought to lawsuits even. So we're good there. We're doing a pretty good job. We're not getting discriminated against mostly in health insurance and employment. Where people are suffering, of course, is long-term care and life insurance. And there's been good progress in a lot of states, a lot due to a organization called FORCE, which is about being empowered about facing cancer. And the team there has done a great job state to state getting a variety of things done, which might be a much better way to do this. There occasionally are groups that come to us saying, can we open this on the federal level again? And would you be willing to help spearhead it? And so far I've said no, largely because I am afraid that that right could be taken away. And I'm particularly afraid in this administration, if we make it obvious that we have that right, then it might be just demolished. I also, having sat there for 12 and a half years, 2 o'clock in the morning with Democrats and Republican staffers, because it's mostly staffers that decide these things, and negotiating, we did take out those two pieces, life insurance and long-term care. They were in there initially, and it wouldn't pass with those because there were a couple problems. We had major opponents in the Chamber of Commerce and the insurance industry. They finally agreed, and it passed unanimously in the House and Senate because we took those out, partly because. But one of the things that I realized as we did it is it is a hard thing because life insurance and long-term care insurance are a gamble game for the insurer. Whereas, health insurance is a kind of gamble, but it's day to day and it's dynamic. And now I'm gambling that, okay, you have, Huntington gene repeats, and I know you're going to get Huntington's disease, but I'm still going to give you life insurance or long-term care insurance, just like I would the person next to you who doesn't have those two things. Well, that's a pretty bad bet for me. And maybe I should be structuring my industry such the person next to you is paying for your long-term care and your life insurance. But I don't know that we've also been so intelligent about those industries and the way that they assess risk and benefit and how they're crafted. And you said at the start of your question, this is a problem in the US. It's not a problem elsewhere. We are a country where we do not have a right to higher education. We don't have a right to healthcare. We don't have a right to being cared for in our old age. We don't have a right to die in some ways that are also possible in other places. And so without all those kind of normal human rights, I would say, that's my personal opinion, we are stuck in this place where we've made an economy out of taking care of those things that other countries just see as part of their public responsibility.
Yeah, it's interesting. You end up optimizing around these constraints that you're not going to shift to a single payer system in the US.
Yeah.
We have in the UK, and that changes the landscape of this fundamentally. So it's a really interesting point you made around timing as well. You have to be very patient in advocacy, and you have to choose the moment. Was that obvious to you from the beginning, or is that something that you've learned hard way through? You're picking the wrong time on some of these.
Oh my gosh. So I was from Connecticut and Massachusetts, and really all I knew is how a bill becomes a law by whatever that singing group. Yeah, that was it. And so when I moved to taking the leadership of Genetic Alliance and coming to DC regularly, and then I moved to DC, and then I went to Congress every day for years, I was shocked by all of it. I was shocked, first of all, that they would listen to me. I'm just an ordinary person. There were the cool dude lobbyists with their, three-piece suits or stiletto high heels on, and I was not that. But they did listen to me. And so the people have a voice, which is incredible. The second thing I learned is that the partisanship was intense, but not when we were behind closed doors. So that
Mm.
was great. I heard that that's not true anymore. That was really enjoyable, that we actually rolled up our sleeves and got stuff done and then went for a beer afterwards. Didn't matter what side of the aisle you were from. And then the third thing was I did also make mistakes. There were places where I didn't understand the vested interest of a particular group, like the the Chamber of Commerce or the insurer kind of coalitions. And so I pitched the wrong thing or said the wrong thing. And so learned as I went, really. And there was one day that was pretty scary because we had gotten to the point where we knew we had all the votes. We had an incredible Republican advocate, Judy Biggert from Illinois, and she had worked alongside Louise Slaughter from New York, who was amazing and had led it all these years, and Kennedy, and and so on. And we knew we had the votes. And all of a sudden I got called to, I think, to the House side, and who appeared were Senate and House staffers, which was remarkable. They don't usually cross the chambers that way. And they just sat me down and reamed me out. I mean, I called it Bloody Monday after that. I was shocked. What they didn't want, these are all Democrats, they did not want the bill to pass because George Bush was the president. And they did not want a
They
Republican
wanted to get
president
credit.
to sign it. And they wanted to wait till the following year in the new Congress when they hoped there would be a Democrat. I just was shocked, shocked, shocked that they would let that level of partisanship influence something we had worked so long. It didn't matter because we went forward and the bill was passed, and George Bush, in fact, we waited to put it on his desk because he was off at his daughter's wedding. And if you delay too long and the president doesn't sign it, it's essentially a veto.
Automatic. Right.
Yeah. Yep. So we waited. He got back from the wedding. We put it on his desk and he signed it. And we were just thrilled. I have it hanging on the wall here, the bill with his signature on it. And I'm really, really happy we got it passed. But again, that was a surprise when I was working
Yes.
in this so intensely.
That's an amazing story. What piece of legislation or advocacy challenge would you love to be able to tackle if you had the right climate that you could pitch it into?
Yeah, I think I would want to tackle getting it confirmed through law that Medicare, Medicaid, because they administer the nation's underserved individuals, would guarantee that the high throughput technologies, the advanced technologies that we have today, would be available to kids.
Yeah.
And that we would also and this would be totally a underserved populations bill, which again, this is not the right climate, clearly, but it would also address that when those kids got diagnosed, they got access to drug or therapy or device, and that those would be subsidized by the government. And, we'd have to put in place all the bells and whistles of what's the income cutoffs and, all that sort of stuff, but that kids in America don't have to suffer the way they do just because they're born in a certain community or born to a certain geographic area, I think is unconscionable in an advanced nation like this.
I've heard a few people say that that kids are surprisingly under cared for in a lot of advanced medical systems. Is that your perspective as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some great efforts in the US on the basis of something, for example, called PedsNet, which are the pediatric hospitals. Last I knew, there were 90. There's probably more that have joined together to say we got to give kids care and we got to share data about that care and so forth. But yeah, I think in general, I mean, we know that drugs, for example, are not tested in children usually, and the excuses people give is because they don't want to harm a child and they'd rather test in an adult. But then when you get to administering to a child, the care is just not there. And that I think because when technologies race forward, they often get deployed for the loudest audiences, and those certainly would be sick adults and probably affluent ones. And so we are increasing disparities both for underserved, under-resourced communities in general, and then children especially. And they are not seen the way that I think adults are. They don't fall out of the workforce, for example, so they don't get counted the way that adults do.
Yeah. That I was going to speculate about the economic force there. That it is you have to project 20 years in the future for a 5-year-old, and it becomes an economic question rather than a one of human rights and decency.
Yeah. Yep.
A couple of fun ones as we finish off here. I was curious about actually how you learn, because When you started all of this, I think you've described yourself before as a homeschooling mom that does not have a degree in science, but yet you have learned more. You've gotten PhDs worth in multiple rare diseases. I'm curious about how you learned. You did not have large language models that could tutor you back when you started this. What did you do then, and what have you learned about learning?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think how I learn anything is to dive in very deeply as fast as I can and then realize what I don't know. And in the case of PXE, went to, we had just moved to Sharon, Massachusetts, drove back to Worcester, Mass, where I knew there was a library. And how stupid is this? I didn't even know there were medical libraries in Boston. So that's how I have a master's in religious studies. I'm a former college chaplain and a former nun. I'm homeschooling my kids and I'm teaching them swimming at the Y and blah, blah, blah. So got copied papers on a Xerox machine because, yes, we don't have any computers. We don't have large language models, nothing. Read those papers and realized I don't understand 90% of the words in these papers. Called various people that had written these papers. And again, what an amazing, generous community are the researchers. Really amazing. They spent hours on the phone with me. We met. They tutored me. Bought dictionaries and encyclopedias. Did a couple of modules of courses I could find. Did a Brandeis University genetic counseling one day long thing to see even what was DNA with a woman named Judith Sipsis who ran the program at the time. Stuff like that. And then ever since then, anything I come upon that I don't know, I do the same thing. Now I also have the companion of have large language models and AI to just plug my question into. I think what I've learned about learning is first not to be afraid, because I think that what I observe in a lot of people is that they're afraid if they don't know and sound stupid, it's not going to fly. And I'm willing to sound stupid because a lot of times I am stupid about that thing. And then the other thing I've learned is something that one of my board members said to me long ago, which he loves to tell our new staff or new board members, you're never so smart as your first 10 minutes here. And I think my not knowing how it worked allowed me to say, I'm going to build a registry. It's on a spreadsheet. No, now I'm going to use FileMaker Pro because I just found this program. I'll teach myself the program, so on. Because I didn't have the status quo kind of conditions that others have and see them, don't even see them, don't even see the walls because they live in that box. And no offense at all, because I think I live in certain boxes too that I don't see outside of. But I got to just say, why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we have our own biobank? Why wouldn't I run the research as a layperson? Why wouldn't I sit at the table? That sort of thing it just was common sense to me rather than, oh, that's not done. Because I didn't know what's not done. And so I think in learning for me, it's not being afraid to not know. And in fact, keeping that high level of curiosity, even somewhat cultivated, so that I am still not knowing when I do know. Because I think as long as I keep curious, I'm going to learn much more quickly.
Yeah, that's amazing. One more fun one. You mentioned before you were a nun. I think you've also practiced Buddhism previously. What can members of the rare disease or precision medicine community learn from Buddhism or practicing a spiritual life more generally?
Yeah. Thank you for the question, Patrick. And I now practice a combination of engaged Buddhism, a more sort of light version of that, and haven't left behind all the other spiritual pieces as well, because I think there are a bunch of things, especially the social justice and liberation theology that comes out of the church. I think it's essential, and in fact, it's become more and more of what I also do in the communities I'm in. So I'm very involved in something called Gestalt Awareness Practice, and I'm just founded a new nonprofit with some friends called the Gestalt Practice Library and Resource
Staying
Center.
busy.
Yes. And my point for me there is that we can't do any of this if we're not resourced. And I think what Buddhism, Taoism, even good spiritual practices offer us is that ability to pause, the ability to say, I need to plug into whatever supports me. And that could be everything from eating cookies to skiing to sitting and meditation, doesn't matter. And then also to say, I have this one precious life, per Mary Oliver's poem. What is it I want to do with it? And how can I keep refreshing my showing up in life in a way that allows me to be seated in a grounded way to then do the work that I need to do. And probably especially that fear piece for me. I think I would lean toward fear, but without this work, with this work, I'm able to lean into a variety of things and know when I need to back off and know when I need to come forward, but at the same time to find the support I need to do the work I need to do. So I think I love to say to rare disease advocates, because my goodness, you're a mom or a dad and you got a little kid and they're very sick and you really are charging ahead and doing the thing relentlessly. But if you don't take time to just pause, to sit back, to feel support, to feel company, and to be seen and heard in a different way than your advocacy and your barnstorming, you're not going to be able to keep this up and you won't be as effective. So, and the same for executives who are running massive labs or companies or clinics. I think that's the way that we humans recharge.
Amazing. This has been a remarkable conversation. For someone who seems so fearless, I appreciate you talking about fear and the role that it plays. You don't come across as fear being a part of the equation. So it's really nice to hear the fact that you like all of us have to confront that.
Yes, absolutely.
Great. Well, Sharon, thank you. This is incredible. Thank you for the conversation. Also, just thank you for all the work you've done over the past decades to make a difference in this community. If people want to follow your work, stay in touch, help you in any way, what would be the most useful thing?
Yeah, I think going to either geneticalliance.org or sharon@geneticalliance.org. I leave my contact information all over the internet, so just Google me.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing all your time with us.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Great interview.
That wraps up this week's episode of the Genetics Podcast. I'd like to give a huge thank you to our guests for sharing their valuable insights and experience. And thank you as well to our listeners, as always, for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's talk, the number one thing I would really appreciate from you is if you could share it with a friend or colleague who you think would enjoy it as well. We would also really appreciate if you could subscribe to our show and give us a quick rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Both of these things help us become more visible when people search for genetics and precision medicine podcasts. And we're always eager to hear from you. Please reach out to us with any questions or feedback on social media. You can find Sanogenetics on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit sanogenetics.com. Finally, a big thank you to the team behind the scenes who make all this possible. In particular, Amy Cousins and Sonia Shah, who produced the show, and James Pierce from Selected Frequencies, who handles the audio engineering. I'm Patrick Short, your host, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on the Genetics Podcast.